They said he was dangerous, but when my hand touched his forehead, sweaty and trembling, he called me Mom, and something inside me that I thought was dead breathed again. During the war, I learned that the deepest dangers rarely came in uniform. Sometimes they arrived barefoot, wounded, calling for someone who was no longer there. Other times, they called for me, and I answered, not as a nurse, but as a woman, as someone who had also lost much more than she was saying. War taught us to separate our own from others, to keep a distance between what we felt and what we did. There was always a list of who should be saved, who could wait, who was already too late. And he wasn't on any of them. No name, no number, no regiment, only blood, and eyes that carried a hunger I knew well, the hunger to belong. I should have backed away, followed protocol, looked the other way as I was told. But when he called me Mother, something in me returned to the moment I buried my boy, and was never called that again. It wasn't rational. None of it was. But in that stuffy room, smelling of ether and damp sheets, I chose the impossible, and I began to treat it as if it were my own, as if I could reverse time with restraints and blasts of cold water. And now, after so many years, I still wonder, who in the suit saved whom there? Because since that day, my solitude has never had the same name, and my silence has never again been the same kind of emptiness. My name is Cora Mae Donnelly. I'm 90 years old, though my body seems to have a few more. And my soul, perhaps a few less. I live alone in an old apartment here in Chicago, where the living room clock stopped almost 2 years ago. But I've never had the courage to wind it again. Sometimes I think it stopped at the same moment my memory decided to reopen certain doors. I was a nurse at a British airbase during the London bombings, caring for men too broken to count, and some who only wanted to pretend they were still whole. War taught us all to hide the cracks. But there's one I've never been able to disguise. There's a name I never wrote, a presence that never officially existed, but which, even so, visits me from time to time. I'll tell you this story, but don't expect maps, dates, or medals. What I kept is something else. Sit here with me, if you can. Because this story never had paper, nor was it recorded. But it lodged where no archive could reach. And if you feel like some memories only live on when they're heard, then subscribe to the channel. Here, even what was lost finds a place. There was a specific smell that preceded certain men. It wasn't just blood. It was something denser, as if time itself had shattered around them. I smelled it that night before I even saw him. A smell of hot metal, wet wool, and something burned, but it didn't come from outside. It was the smell of what remains after someone is ripped from themselves. He arrived carried on the shoulders of 2 soldiers who barely knew where to leave him. The men's eyes didn't ask for help. They asked for distance. And I understood. He was the kind of wounded man who didn't come with a warning, only a warning. They placed him on one of the last stretchers near the door, where the wind filtered through the cracks in the makeshift canvas of the infirmary. And even there, on the edge of everything, he exuded a presence that drew attention, but not in a good way. I went to him on impulse or out of distraction, I don't know. Maybe because I noticed no one else wanted to get close. The sheet under his body was already stained before I could touch it. Dark, dense, thick blood, different from the others. Not because of the type, but because of the way it seemed to gush unhurriedly, as if the body were already tired of trying to stay alive. The file he came with was stamped in red. Isolate. Possible infiltrate. Nothing more. No name, no registration number, no date of admission. And yet, when I bent to clean the wound on his abdomen, he shivered, as if sensing my presence, even though he was unconscious. His skin was hot, almost feverish. I murmured softly, as I always did with the worst cases, "You're safe now." And at that moment, even through the daze, his lips moved. Almost imperceptibly, a scratching sound came from it. I couldn't make out what it was, so I leaned closer. That's when he said softly, with a raspy, sleepwalking voice, "Mom, don't go away." My hand froze in the middle of the compress. I can't describe what I felt. Perhaps a silent blow, an echo from far away, something that had lingered for years in a whisper. I should have backed away. Logic, protocol, everything told me to let someone else take over the case. But I stayed. I stood there, feeling the warmth of his forehead beneath my fingers, while my chest ached in a way it hadn't in a long time, because no one called me that anymore. Mother. That word, spoken in that feverish, half-dead state, shattered me more than any night siren. It brought me back to a tomb I'd been trying to keep closed for decades. I tried to push the thought away, but my hands were shaking. I continued cleaning slowly, as if touching something sacred. Each cut was like an unfinished sentence. Each bruise, a memory I didn't want to reopen. He was bleeding inside, too, and not just on his body. He was bleeding a kind of absence I knew. It was the same hole I'd carried since I lost my boy, the same silent question, the same cold in the early hours. So, even with the red stamp on the file, even with the strange silence of the others around, I decided he would stay there, under my eyes, under my watch. Not by order, not by duty, but because something inside me had already recognized him, and maybe I had already loved him, even without knowing who he was. In those days, the sirens came before the light, before any human noise, before the smell of coffee, or the warmth of the first ray of light through the crack in the tent. It was always their sound, sharp, impersonal, merciless, that woke our bones. And even after the bombardment ceased, the silence that remained was even more unbearable, because it was accompanied by what was missing, the soldier who never returned, the scream that was swallowed, the name no one would call again. It was in this interval between the sirens and the silence that I moved. A suspended time, a territory where clocks didn't know what to do with their hands. And it was during this interval that I returned to his stretcher. The others continued treating the catalogued cases, the wounds named and with defined severity. Me? I approached him as if returning to the place where they'd been hit but hadn't healed. He stood there, motionless, but not empty. He was breathing, yes, but with effort. And the fever was already beginning to steal the contours of his face, sweat on his forehead, tremors in his fingers, his trembling lips moving in unfinished words. I watched him from afar sometimes, trying to understand what kept me there. He was dangerous, they said, an infiltrator, a man with no past, no papers, no one to guarantee his humanity. But he was also a warm body amidst the cold of orders. He was, against everything, a silent plea for care. I went to the supply closet and prepared a mustard and flaxseed poultice, an old recipe we only used in cases of stubborn fever. I remember that, as I crushed the seeds, my hands began to sweat. And it wasn't from the heat of the water. It was from what I was about to do. Truly care for him. No longer as a curiosity, but as someone I'd decided, in that moment, not to let die. That was how I crossed a border from which there was no return. As I pressed the warm cloth to his chest, I felt my breathing change. And again, he murmured. But this time, it wasn't Mom. It was a longer, disjointed sentence, lost between fever and fear. She found me, Mom. Don't let them. And he drifted off again. I wanted to say I didn't tremble, but I did. Not from fear, from memory. Because those words seemed to come from a letter I never wrote. A recurring nightmare from before, when my son was still alive. It was as if he, this wounded stranger, this nameless man, was returning to me fragments of a past that was mine alone. And I wondered, how could he know? How could that trembling voice access so much? In the ward, some began to whisper, "She's become attached to him. He'll eventually get lost. It's the same old pattern. Cases without a record always bring misfortune." I heard, but I didn't listen. It was too late. I had already crossed that minefield that separates protocol from compassion. And every time he shivered, I adjusted the sheet. Every time his fever rose, I changed the cloth. And every time he whispered, "Mom," even without seeing me, I responded even without knowing what that would make of me. War taught us to choose between obedience and risk. I chose risk, because between the sirens and the silence, he was the only thing that still made me feel alive. His fever arrived like bad memories, without warning and wanting to stay. The thermometer I used was old, cracked at one end, but it still worked. Almost 40 degrees, and rising. This wasn't just a consequence of the injury anymore. It was his body shutting down in defense. It was the past screaming from within. I'd seen many like this. But about him, there was something that made me want to try harder. Something that wasn't in his vital signs, but in what escaped between his half-closed eyes and his unyielding jaw. I prepared the isolation. Not a real one. We didn't have the infrastructure for that back then. It was symbolic. A screen of hanging sheets and the chair I dragged into the corner, next to it. There I stayed. All night long, changing damp cloths, murmuring things even I couldn't quite understand. "You'll get through this. Stay with me. Breathe." Things I said without really knowing to whom. Maybe more to myself. Maybe to my son, who also had a fever, years before, and who also resisted to the end. For an instant, his fever became mine. His heat burned me inside, but it wasn't illness. It was longing. It was what I'd never let die completely. The memory of the last time I'd cradled my boy, of his sweating body in my arms, of the bittersweet smell of childhood mixed with premature death. I saw myself there, and I felt my throat close, as if the fever had invaded my own blood. I tried to write a report on him, the records we all had to fill out, even for unidentified cases. But my pen shook, and all I could manage was febrile patient, resisting, calling for someone. I scribbled the word mother in the margin, then erased it. I couldn't leave it there. They couldn't see what it was doing to me, because if they did, they might take him away, and I wasn't ready to let him go. Not again. Not like my little boy. The next morning, the fever wouldn't break. He was more delirious. He called out incoherent names. But he always returned to that one. Mom. As if it were an anchor. As if, even without seeing me, he knew I was there. And I was. I always was. Ever since I first entered that ward, years ago, I'd been searching for a place where I could be useful in a way that hurt. But I never imagined I'd find that in someone marked as dangerous. Sometimes I wondered if it was real, if he wasn't just an incarnation of my pain, a shadow created by guilt and longing. But then he would grab my wrist, even unconscious, and whisper, "Don't leave me." And in that touch there was flesh, there was warmth, there was humanity. It wasn't delirium, it was a bond. It was the kind of thing the war doesn't teach, but also can't erase. His fever didn't go down that night, but I didn't leave either. And when morning came, I realized the one who had started to heal was me. In war, we learn to notice what isn't obvious. The small details, a misplaced button, a tear stitched with the wrong thread, the smell of soap from a country that wasn't ours. Because sometimes that's where the danger lies. Other times, that's where the longing lies. And it was in one of those details that my world turned a little more upside down. I was changing his shirt, which was no longer a shirt, just a scrap of fabric with holes in the shoulders and a torn collar. As I unbuttoned it, I noticed that one of the buttons didn't match the others. It was mother of pearl, a little larger, lighter, and held in place with blue thread, the same thread my mother used to mend my son's clothes when he was little. The button had been sewn on carefully, but by hurried hands. My curiosity overcame protocol. Hidden in the inside seam of the shirt, between the hem and the fold of the armpit, was a folded piece of paper taped with old medical tape. I gently removed it. It was a charred fragment. A photograph, perhaps. Or a letter. The edge was burned, with a jagged outline that looked as if it had been hastily torn from something larger. When I unfolded it, my eyes locked. The image was almost illegible, but there was the outline of a woman sitting, perhaps in a garden, perhaps on a park bench. Her face was distorted by the heat and humidity. But I swear by everything I felt, that those eyes, even blurred, looked like mine. I stood still, my heart hammering against my chest, as if something had been forced open inside me. It couldn't be. It was illogical. I hadn't taken any photos like that, not during the war. And yet, there was something about that image that gave me the feeling of a broken mirror, as if it were a memory that wasn't mine, but could have been. I kept the piece of paper in my pocket without telling anyone. And that night, while he slept, I removed the fake button with the tip of a pair of scissors and hid it next to the photo. My head throbbed, my stomach tightened. It was too much of a coincidence not to hurt. I began to doubt reality. What if he knew me from before? What if this war was just the setting for a reunion that time or madness had planned for me? Once again, logic screamed at me, and I turned down the volume. Because when he woke up, sweaty, pale, with a confused look, and tried to speak, nothing came out. He just stared at me, long and lingering, as if he knew exactly who I was. And even without saying a word, when I tried to pull back the sheets, to change the bandage, he grabbed my wrist and squeezed. Not hard, gently, like my son did when he wanted me to stay by his bed longer. At that moment, I put off reasoning, because sometimes what makes sense isn't what saves you. And I was already too far from shore to swim back. It was a dawn I still carry within me. One of those times that seem to exist outside of time, where the air weighs more heavily and the clock dares not make a sound. The ward was silent, broken only occasionally by the creaking of metal structures in the cold wind. The others slept, or pretended to sleep. I stayed, with him. The fever seemed to have broken, but the delirium still came in waves. He tossed and turned occasionally, sweating with fear, muttering words mixed with sounds of pain and memory. I sat there, in the same corner, the gray blanket covering my legs and my hands in my lap. It was a painful but necessary silence, until he spoke again. Mother? It was low, fragile, almost a breath, and unlike the other times, he seemed conscious. His eyes were half closed, moist. He looked in my direction, but unfocused, as if calling out to a presence he already knew, even without clearly seeing its face. And for a moment, I still can't explain. I responded. I'm here, son. Just like that, without hesitation. Without thinking, the words came out of me like a forgotten prayer, and as soon as I said them, my chest seemed to fill with a warmth I hadn't felt in years. A warmth that didn't come from the infirmary, but from within, from a hidden corner of me that had never been touched since. He let out a soft breath, like a sigh of relief, as if, in that answer, he'd found ground. And I felt the tears well up, silent, hot, shameful even, because what I'd done was cross a line no one there could see, but which I knew existed. The line between care and surrender, between professional and woman, between absence and attachment. I spent the night repeating that gesture, adjusting the blanket, changing the cloth on his forehead, listening to his breathing with the attention of a mother. Truly, not from fantasy, not from memory, with a kind of truth that war doesn't recognize, but that imposes itself nonetheless. And as he got better, slowly, but noticeably, I got worse, because I knew what that meant. I knew what would come next. The first time he called me Mom was a fracture. The first time I responded was when I accepted what was bleeding inside me. The next day, I heard heavier footsteps approaching. People from outside, officers. Someone had filed a report. Someone knew I was getting too close. And it was there, in that sound of hard boots on the wooden floor, that I realized he didn't want to be saved. At least, not in the way I imagined. It wasn't long before the whispers began. In places like that, where pain shares space with boredom and fear, any unusual gesture becomes a topic of conversation. I walked the halls with my bandage bag and thermometer in my apron pocket, but I wasn't as noticed as before. The looks had changed. Curious, suspicious, some even pitying. And I knew why. She's getting confused, poor thing. Are you sure he's not manipulating her? This kind of attachment is dangerous, especially coming from an unregistered patient. They didn't speak directly to me. They never would. But they left loose phrases close enough for me to hear. And that was what hurt the most, because no one there knew what he said when he called Mom. No one saw the way he calmed down when I pressed the towel to his forehead. No one felt what was born in the void between my loss and his loneliness. It was a place only the two of us inhabited, a hiding place with no walls, only feelings. The ward supervisor called me in for a chat. He wanted to know why I insisted on caring for him. He said with a measured air that other cases required attention, that this man was complicated, potentially dangerous, and above all, irrelevant to the strategic developments of the war. These words hurt me more than any shrapnel I'd ever pulled from another's skin. Irrelevant. As if a human being could be discarded based on a role that never existed. I returned to the infirmary in silence. And there, on the other side of the makeshift screen, he slept. His breathing steadier, his face less tense. He was getting better. He simply was. And that was what kept me going, despite the rumors. Each small step forward was like a drop of healing in my own wound, even if no one believed it. Even if, to others, I was being fooled. The cruelest thing about war isn't the bodies that fall. It's the way it hardens those who survive, how it turns compassion into suspicion, how it erases names and replaces them with labels. And that's what they did to him. The stranger, the infiltrator, the wounded man who shouldn't be here. But for me, he was the only one who reminded me that I still had something to give other than technique, something the manuals didn't teach. That same evening when I returned to the station, I found a note left on my desk. It was anonymous. It simply said, "He's not who you think. Be careful." It wasn't signed, but the handwriting was feminine. I knew it well. It was from one of the girls in the neighboring ward, too young to know what it's like to lose a child, but old enough to judge a woman who lost hers and dared to love again, even if she wasn't sure. I put the paper away without saying anything, like someone folding a used handkerchief and putting it away in a drawer, because what they said in the hallways might echo, but it wouldn't penetrate me. I had already chosen, and deep down I knew. It wasn't just him being watched, it was me, and yet I would keep going to him, until the end. At first glance it seemed like a minor detail, a small thing, unimportant, but I'd always noticed the rituals of the sick, the way they pull the sheet up to their chin, the way they hide their feet when they're afraid, or the way they turn to the left side as if trying to escape a recurring nightmare. He did this, every night, just like my son did, always to the left side, as if there were something invisible there that could protect him. I noticed this right after a sheet change. The nurse who'd relieved me that afternoon had mechanically adjusted the bed, as per protocol. The pillow was centered, the edges triangularly folded, everything symmetrical. But as soon as he lay down, still breathing heavily, I saw the discomfort. He moved his neck slowly, then turned his body, and only relaxed when the pillow touched the left side of his neck. Then I understood. It was the gesture. It wasn't comfort. It was habit. The almost instinctive need to position himself as he always did, even without remembering exactly why. The next night, before he woke, I carefully turned the pillow. I folded the pillowcase imperfectly, purposefully crooked, the same way I did for my boy. And seeing him rest there, effortlessly, with a lightness that didn't suit his condition, my chest tightened, not with pain, with recognition. I knew that gesture, that silent surrender to his favorite side of the bed. It was too intimate, too familiar. It was the kind of thing you don't invent, you carry. From that day on, I started doing other little things. I would put warm water at the same temperature I used for my son's compresses. I would warm his feet with a dry cloth before putting on his socks. And I would always keep the chair turned at an angle where I could see him, and he could feel me there, even when he was sleeping. I knew I was crossing the line, that this was no longer just clinical care. But I couldn't stop, because in every small gesture I repeated there was a kind of healing for me too, as if, by rebuilding these habits, I could stitch back together a time that had been stolen from me, and give loneliness a new name. One night, when I came in with the clean towel, he opened his eyes for a second and whispered, "You always turn the pillow, just like she did." I froze. He closed his eyes again. He didn't explain. He didn't say who she was. But something about that sentence stuck, just like she did. I returned to my room unsure whether to laugh or cry. Who was she? Me? Another woman? The real mother? Or some distorted memory from before the war? It unsettled me, but it didn't push me away. Quite the opposite. It gave me the strange feeling that, somehow, he knew me too, albeit by a different name. And in that silence, filled with unanswered questions, a certainty settled in. I wasn't just healing a body, I was reconstituting a bond. And even though it had no name, no logic, no permission, that bond was already all I had. I've always taken special care of my hair, even amidst the chaos, the mud, the gunpowder, and the blood. There was something sacred about combing someone's sleeping hair. Maybe because it was a gesture my mother made for me. Or maybe because, after losing my son, I needed to find ways to continue being a mother to something. He was getting better. Slowly, yes, but he was. His eyes stayed open longer, his breathing less labored. And that morning, while the infirmary was still empty, I decided to wash him. His head, especially. The sweat was already mixed with dried crusts of blood and soot. I prepared a basin with warm water, the mild soap, and the towel. It was a ritual I repeated almost silently, like someone praying. When I ran the old comb I carried with me, the same one I'd used on my boy throughout his childhood, something inside me snapped. His hair was thick, dark, very different from the light, fine strands I'd used to detangle years ago. But my fingers seemed oblivious. They moved with the same tenderness, the same delicacy, as if that gesture already knew the way. And it was at that moment that memory betrayed me. Or saved me. I still don't know. Because for a brief moment, when the light from the window touched his face, I swear I saw, the outline of my son. The line of his jaw, the way his eyelashes curled. The resemblance was impossible. Impossible. And real. My eyes filled with tears, but I continued, combing, touching, like someone combing through the past, one strand at a time. He opened his eyes slowly and whispered, "You did this when I was scared." His voice was distant, almost childish. I wanted to ask what he meant by that, but I didn't have the courage, because deep down, I didn't want to hear an answer that would take me away from that place where I, once again, was called mother. His hair was clean when I finished. More than clean. Straight. As if they'd never been in a war. And when he settled back onto the pillow, facing left, I realized he'd smiled. A small smile, but there. His first, since he arrived. I left the infirmary with the comb still in my hand. I didn't want to put it away. I kept it there, between my fingers, for the rest of the day, like a belated umbilical cord. Something that still connected me to a past that insisted on reappearing with a different face. And it was in that touch, in that repeated nameless gesture, that I realized maybe love doesn't need certainty. Maybe it just needs a place. And in that man, who they said was dangerous, unknown, suspicious, I found a place where my forgotten love could exist again, even if only for a few mornings combed in silence. There were things I never said to anyone, not even to myself out loud. My son's name was one of them. I kept it like someone burying an unopened letter, afraid of what I might find inside. After he left, I decided the world no longer needed to hear that sound. Just 3 syllables. But they tore me apart every time they threatened to escape my throat. That morning he was awake. Not for long. Lucidity still came in fragments. But there was something different in his eyes. A focus. A glow. A firmer presence. I brought him the bowl of porridge with honey and fed him little by little. He accepted it with the calm of someone who trusted. And that, for me, was everything. It was then, without me saying anything, he whispered, "Gabriel." The spoon stopped in midair. The name hit me like a shard of glass in the chest. Gabriel. That was your name, wasn't it? I remember. My entire body froze. There was no way he could know. Not in that place. Not in that situation. No one on the base knew. I avoided speaking. It was a choice, a way to protect what was left of me. And yet, there it was. The name. In the mouth of a man who had no record, no past, no reason to know my pain. I tried to maintain control. I adjusted the sheet, looked away, and continued as if nothing had been said. But inside, everything was in ruins. "How do you know that name?" I thought. But I didn't ask, because the fear of the answer was greater than my curiosity. He closed his eyes, but his hand reached for mine. And even feverish with chapped lips, he whispered once more. "He wasn't afraid when you sang to him." At that moment, I almost dropped the bowl. That was too specific. It was a memory. One I'd buried so deep I no longer knew if it was real. I used to sing it to Gabriel when he had nightmares. an old lullaby my grandmother used to sing to me. But this, no one knew this. I left the infirmary with unsteady steps. The world seemed distorted. Time and space blurred. What was possible? What was memory? Who, after all, was that man? For hours I wondered if my mind was playing tricks on me, if this was just another way for grief to manifest itself. But that night, when I returned to change his bandages, he was sleeping peacefully, and in his sleep, he murmured again, "Gabriel, Mommy's here." I don't remember crying like this since the funeral, but I cried, silently, with my back to him, with the washcloth pressed against my face, because in that moment, I understood there was something between us that transcended name, role, or reason, something that neither time nor war, nor logic could explain. It was on a muggy afternoon that I noticed. I was changing the bandages on his chest, focused on the wound near his ribs. Well healed, but still tender. He was sleeping, or pretending to be. Sweat trickled down his collarbone, and his damp skin revealed more than it should. It was there, in that ordinary, almost automatic moment, that my eyes fell on his left shoulder, and froze. A mark, dark, irregular, almost faded. It wasn't a wound. It was a tattoo. I hesitated. The world seemed to narrow around me. My hands stilled, still clutching the gauze bandage. The mark was partially obscured by shadow, but even so, I saw enough. 3 curved claw-like lines encircling a cross. It was a symbol, one I didn't fully recognize, or didn't want to. A part of me wanted to wake him and ask. Another, smaller, more whispered part begged me to let it go, to pretend I hadn't seen, because sometimes knowing too much robs us of the last shred of peace. And I was already hanging by a thread. I continued to bandage it as if nothing had happened, but the mark throbbed in my memory like a burn that hadn't yet healed. That night I tried to draw it from memory, with graphite pencil on an old prescription sheet. My hand trembled. The lines were crooked, but the outline was precise. I searched through the old papers we had, through informal lists of defector groups and faction symbols. Nothing. But that didn't ease my pain. Because deep down, I knew. That mark wasn't just a tattoo. It was a hidden history, a buried identity. I surreptitiously watched his shoulder for the next few days. Sometimes he seemed to protect that area even in his sleep, as if he knew it held something that could become a sentence. I wanted to deny it. I wanted to believe it was all in my head. But every time I adjusted his shirt, my hand avoided that side, as if the touch might awaken something not yet ready to surface. I began to wonder, what if that mark belonged to a hostile group? What if he had hurt someone? What if he was truly dangerous, as so many said? The conflict inside me was unbearable, between the woman who fed him and changed his sheets, and the nurse who was supposed to follow orders. But then he would wake up. He would call me Mom. He would touch my hand as if seeking shelter. And everything would fall apart again. Because there, before me, there was no symbol. There was someone, a broken, confused man who, inexplicably, knew my son's name. And maybe I chose not to know anymore. Because sometimes love needs ignorance to survive. And I had already lost too much love to risk losing it again. He began to appear on the edges of my routine, first as a discreet shadow, then as a constant presence. He wore neither a nurse's uniform nor a doctor's badge. He was tall, thin, with a face obscured by an expression that always seemed uncomfortable with the existence of others. The kind of man who didn't step foot where he didn't have a reason. And yet he was always there. At the door, He never spoke to me. He never asked direct questions. He just watched, arms crossed or with a clipboard he never seemed to use. He would appear in his most vulnerable moments, when I would sing softly to him during his fevers, or when I would run my fingers through his wet hair, or when I would pull the blanket up to his chin, and he, even asleep, would curl up like a child. There was something about that man that put me on edge. It wasn't fear. It was anticipation, as if he was waiting for the right moment to do something I didn't want to know about. The third time I saw him, I stopped pretending not to notice. I looked back. I didn't say a word. I just stared. He didn't look away. But in that instant, I realized he knew. I don't know how, but he knew about the bond, about the whispered mother. He knew about my choice to see him as more than just a missing number on the file. That night, I dreamed that the wounded man was being taken away while I slept. I woke up gasping for breath and ran to the infirmary. But he was there, calm, alive. And he whispered, "Good morning," like a child waking up at his grandmother's house. But the shadow of the man at the door loomed large. As I went to get supplies, I heard a snatch of conversation coming from the superior's office. "She's grown too attached. We're watching." The phrase lingered. "We're watching." I returned to my post with slower steps. The chair I'd used beside the bed no longer felt as secure. My hands were shaking more as I cleaned the wounds. And every mother he said to me now echoed with a farewell, even if he didn't know it. I began writing little notes and hiding them under his mattress. Health records, fragments of what he said, tattoo sketches. As if I disappeared or he was taken, some trace would remain. A thread of memory woven into the fabric of the world. Because that man, the one at the door, wasn't watching out of curiosity. He was counting time. He was waiting for the right time. And I knew, deep down, that the clock was coming to an end. But I wasn't going to leave him alone. Not again. Not even if it cost me my reputation, my position, or the little peace I had left. Because he wasn't just a wounded man. He was the only one who still called me by a name I thought had been erased from my skin. And for him, I would face even the coldest eyes, even if they were watching from a door that never closed. I was already accustomed to poorly folded sheets, loose corners on clipboards, and drawers that didn't close properly. But that morning, when I went to change the blanket at the foot of his bed, something fell out, something that shouldn't have been there. A piece of paper folded in half and torn at the bottom slid across the floor like a leaf blown by the wind. It wasn't mine. It didn't belong to anyone in the ward. I picked it up carefully. The texture was different. Thick paper, like the kind used for high-level internal orders. I opened it with trembling hands, my heart racing. 2 short typewritten sentences, cold as a sentence. "Don't let them talk. Eliminate if they wake up." My stomach churned. The world spun slowly. I leaned against the bed but didn't let go of the paper. I reread those words as if searching for a misreading, a printing error, anything that might disprove it. But there was no mistake. The order was clear. He must not survive. I swallowed hard. I looked at him. He slept like a child. One arm extended out from under the blanket, his hand relaxed, his chest rising and falling slowly. Who could want to silence someone like that? Why? What did he know? What was he? I tucked the paper inside my bra, close to my heart, as if to keep it safer there. The order was old. Maybe from before he arrived, maybe from before me. But someone had lost or dropped it right there. On purpose? A warning? A trap? My head was pounding. Questions piled up, but no answer mattered more than the growing certainty within me. I was caring for someone marked for permanent silence. And if it weren't for me, he'd already be dead. For the first time, I felt true fear. Fear not of the war outside, but of what moved in the shadows of the base itself. Fear of what I didn't know about him, and what no longer mattered, because it was too late. I had already chosen. I had already bonded. And now, he was mine. My protégé. My secret. My son, borrowed for a time that explained nothing to me. That night, I sat beside his bed and watched him sleep. I ran my fingers over his forehead and thought, if the order still stands, I'll break it. Because sometimes, what you should do isn't what you can. And if this has touched you, listen to the end. Because sometimes, hiding someone is the only way to not lose yourself. I woke with the feeling that something was out of place. It wasn't a noise. It wasn't a siren. It was silence, heavy, dense, thick as fog. I got up, still in my apron, my shoes forgotten in the corner, and walked to the infirmary, my steps too hurried for that hour. The door was ajar. The breeze made the makeshift curtain sway slightly, as if waving goodbye to something. His bed was empty. The sheets were taut, folded to the millimeter. The pillowcase was wrinkle-free. No tray, no dirty clothes, no damp cloths. It was as if no one had slept there, as if no one had been there. I approached slowly, rejecting what his eyes were showing me. I touched the mattress. Cold. He had left hours before, perhaps still in the dark. I turned the pillow. It was still turned to the left. A remnant, a final gesture. I looked around, searching in corners, in storage rooms, even in the isolation wards. No one knew. No one saw. I asked the guys on night patrol. One of them simply said, "Order from above," and looked away. That's when I understood. What had happened wasn't an accident. It was a decision. I walked over to my desk. The papers I'd hidden, the tattoo drawings, the secret records, even the keep quiet order, were all gone. Every single one. As if they'd never existed. I gasped for air. I sat up slowly. My hands trembled. My head throbbed. The pain was physical, as if something had been ripped out of me without anesthesia. I lay there for hours, unsure of what to do. No one mentioned the disappearance. No meeting, no note, no discharge, no change in the situation. It was as if he had never been there. But I knew, and so did my heart, because that night, when I went to fold the sheets on his bed for the last time, I found something under his pillow. A button, mother of pearl, sewn on with blue thread, the same one I had removed days before, the same one I kept. But mine was still with me. Years passed, many. The war ended, at least on paper, and I returned, or tried to return, to civilian life. I traded my uniform for an apron, my bandages for nursing textbooks at a community school here in Chicago. I grew accustomed to the noise of the buses, the smell of sweetbread from the corner bakery, the silence of my apartment. But some things never come back. Normality, for example. I could never again believe that the world was a place where everything had an explanation. It was winter when it happened. I was coming from the library, a packet of tea in my bag, and a book on trauma in my hands. Snow was beginning to pile up on the sidewalk's edges. I hurried to reach the subway before it got dark. That's when I saw it. A man lay at the station entrance, poorly dressed, dirty, exhausted. The others turned away. Some looked with contempt. Others didn't look at all. I stopped. Instinct. I crouched down, touched his shoulder, and said, "Are you okay?" He looked up. His eyes were tired and sunken, but there was something familiar in the expression. "Cora," he murmured. My body froze. The sound of my name coming from that mouth echoed decades ago. I didn't recognize him immediately. He was older, much older. Lined face, thick beard, gap teeth. But the timbre, that timbre. Before I could say anything, someone grabbed my arm. A man in a suit whispered, "Leave it alone, ma'am. This one's always dropping names. He's delirious. He talks about war, about mothers, about names no one knows." I looked again. The man now had his eyes closed, as if he'd said what he needed to, and rested. I didn't say anything. I stood up, but I didn't leave. I sat on the station bench and watched from a distance. A police officer gently pulled him away, as if it were routine. But before disappearing down the stairs, he looked back and made a gesture with his hand. Simple, slow, a short wave. Just like my son did when he was little, and I dropped him off at school. I stood there until the train arrived. I didn't get on. I waited for the next one, and the next one, because something inside me couldn't leave. That night at home, I took the mother-of-pearl button out of the box where I kept it, and for the first time in years, I slept with it in my closed fist. I don't know if it was him. I can't say for sure. But what I can say is, there are names that pierce us like broken mirrors, and when someone whispers them, we recognize them, even without seeing. In my living room, right next to the bookshelf I've never reread, sits an old picture frame. The frame is dark wood, chipped at one corner, and the glass has lost its shine. Inside it, for many years, there was a single photograph. Gabriel, 10 years old, smiling with crooked teeth, sitting in the garden behind the house where everything began and ended. That image was my silent altar, my anchor, my framed mourning. But lately, something has changed. I can't explain it. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't as if someone had changed the photo. I would have noticed. It was more subtle. A detail here, another there. At first, I thought it was the reflection of the light. Then I blamed my own eyes, tired from old age and longing. But now I know. Gabriel's expression is no longer the same. Before, the smile was childish, loose, a little mischievous. Now it seems restrained. The eyes are darker. And there's a shadow at the corner of the mouth that I swear wasn't there before. As if somehow the portrait has aged along with me. I began to look at the photograph more often, in the morning, before tea, at night, before silence. And every time that feeling envelops me, that there is something, or someone, trying to tell me that time is not linear, that some pains return in disguise, that certain faces don't belong to a body. The other day, after returning from the market, I found the picture frame, turned upside down. No one comes in here. No one but me. And yet, it was facing away. I turned slowly, and there he was, the same boy, but not exactly. I took the portrait in my hands. I looked at it for long minutes, and in an involuntary whisper I asked, "And you?" The house responded with the same silence that had accompanied me for decades. But something inside me, deep inside, whispered back, not with words, but with the uneasy certainty that not everything that loves us says goodbye, and not everything that is gone completely. Today the kettle sings more slowly. The sound creeps through the kitchen like a wisp of smoke that refuses to reach the ceiling. I always let the water boil and forget to make the tea. Maybe out of habit. Maybe because the warmth of memory is stronger than any infusion. The living room clock remained still, showing 3:12 a.m. The same time that morning I realized his bed was empty. Sometimes I think about winding it again. But something stops me, as if time there had decided to respect my mourning. The mother-of-pearl button now lives in a small box next to the armchair. The lid is chipped, and the velvet lining is faded. But it remains there, intact, smooth, as if it had never been sewn onto anything, as if it had always been his alone, or mine. There are days when I hold it between my fingers and think, what if it was all made up? But then I remember the portrait, the eyes that changed, the name whispered on that frozen Chicago street, and the brief wave, which no one else saw. The medical form was never filled out. The record never existed. Officially, that man never entered my life. He didn't occupy a bed, he didn't wear a bandage, he didn't call anyone Mom. But my body remembers. My hands, when they touch the warm water, remember the exact temperature of his forehead. And my ear still hears that cracked murmur in the darkness. Don't leave me. For a long time, I blamed myself for not asking more questions, for not demanding answers, for not following leads. But now, with my bones still and my soul slower, I understand. Some stories don't need explanation. They need space, permanence, shared silence. And that's what I leave you with, listening to me now, with this quiet affection in your heart. Don't expect logic in everything, nor justice, nor closure. Sometimes what heals most isn't what we understand. It's what we choose to feel. He called me Mom, and I let him continue. Not because he needed it, but because I needed it. Because there was a love inside me that had nowhere to go. Until a stranger, nameless and unrelated, arrived as if he recognized me before I even opened my eyes. And maybe, just maybe, the universe has given me back a piece of what it took, even if only for a short time, even if under surveillance, even if without guarantees. So if one day you hear someone call you a name that's no longer yours, stop, listen, because it might be an echo coming from where you least expect it. And if this touches some part of you that was dormant, know this is a safe place. Subscribe to the channel. We continue to exist, even when the world forgets us. Now, excuse me, the tea has finally cooled, and the bud will sleep in the palm of my hand today.